lot of people struggle with zone 2 is that they're actually in zone 3, and then you're
Mhm.
sort of past this point of like fat starting to drop. And in the lab, you can see this super clearly. You can just see like below VT1, fat max, carbs are quite low. You make that transition, and it doesn't have to be a very big transition,
Yeah.
and then you just see it flip.
Yeah.
And then now the body's no longer adapting to improving their fat oxidation. It's now improving its ability to consume carbohydrates more efficiently, which is not a bad adaptation to have, but it's extremely limited. And so that's why people run into a stagnation mode where like they're constantly pushing on this very limited kind of lever. And especially when they understand where their VT1 is, shift their training around, and then they just start to explode.
Anar, I want to frame this conversation to answer a question that I think a lot of runners, myself included, have never truly resolved. And that's, how do you know from a physiological standpoint with full confidence that the intensity you're training at is actually zone 2? Now, I specifically zeroed in on zone 2 because that's what I think a lot of older athletes are very interested in these days, whether it's to build the aerobic base or to maximize fat oxidation. And that's the foundation that everything else is built upon. For the last 30 years, heart rate has been the standard intensity metrics for endurance athletes, right? Probably because it's everywhere on everyone's watches these days. But there are a lot of confounders that can influence heart rate, making it, in my opinion, somewhat inaccurate. Then a few years ago, power meters started making their way into running. That, I think, has significantly less confounders that can influence it, but it still needs to be coupled with a runner's or an athlete's physiology or physiological state, right? For example, 250 watts for an elite runner might be a recovery run in zone 2, but for a sedentary adult that is new to running, 250 watts might be a VO2 max interval. Now, we are starting to see continuous lactate meters coming onto the market and ventilation sensor from Tymewear as well. And for a period of time, I thought lactate was the gold standard for measuring intensity until I learned that lactate levels are highly dependent on glucose and glycogen availability. So that kind of throws that out as well, which made me go back to thinking that, the old school talk test, where you can run and have a conversation is the best physiological marker for knowing that you're kind of below your zone 2 ceiling, and that is based on breath or ventilation. So now we have more tools than ever. And to help the listener understand how accurate the data is, I want to talk through first each of these tools, what the positives and negatives are of its measurement. So if we can start with heart rate, what are the positives of having heart rate data during training?
Well, if I can just start with what is zone 2 anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Yeah,
maybe to kind of ground the conversation in just
absolutely.
a simple definition, or at least a lightly technical slash simple definition. So zone 2 is an intensity uh, where the muscles that are working are predominantly using fat
Mhm.
as a fuel source, and this intensity is sustainable for hours and hours. It's but it has a range. There's an upper limit and a lower limit to zone 2. The upper limit is what we call VT1, or the first ventilatory threshold. You can
Okay.
also measure this with lactate, LT1, lactate threshold 1.
Would that also be the aerobic threshold that people refer to in the
Yeah,
sense of aerobic and
exactly.
anaerobic?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. What ends up happening is as you go from zero intensity to maximum intensity, you have this sort of intensity spectrum. The muscles, as you go from 0 to 100, what the transitions that the muscles go through is that from as they go from 0, they will start to increase their fat oxidation. They will be preserving or using very little carbohydrates, and as you increase the intensity, the muscles start to work more and more. Fat oxidation reaches a maximum limit. And as you continue to increase the intensity, you demand more energy consumption. And so
Mhm.
the fat has reached a maximum, and carbs start to make up the difference. VT1, or the top of zone 2, that demarcates this sort of zone 2 that everybody talks about, is the moment at which fat starts to decline because we can no longer service the energy requirement of the work at hand with fat oxidation, and carbs start to make up the difference, and become the predominant fuel source. This happens on an individual basis. So, for example, we work with some of the best athletes in the world, competing at the world tour level. They will have this limit happening at outrageously high workloads.
Yeah. Yeah.
This limit for them will basically be above most, maybe above 90% of people's VO2 max.
Hmm.
And just to put that into context, these are incredible athletes, but it's the same physiological phenomenon. And so it's highly individual, and it doesn't necessarily, it does not correlate with even VO2 max. So, for example, or
Okay.
heart rate max. So your percentages of, if you take, for example, a fixed percentage of your VO2 max or fixed percentage of your heart rate max, that will not pinpoint this transition point. You can have two people with identical VO2 maxes with dramatically different VT1 or top of zone 2 transition points. And that's why it's so important to measure where this point occurs, know where it is, and
Physiologically, right?
physiologically,
Yeah, yeah.
this is a physiological indicator. So what is it that's happening that is causing this transition that we can measure? So when we look at ventilation and lactate, these spring from the same source. Ventilation is a byproduct of needing to get the carbon dioxide that is created when you break down carbohydrates in the muscle. This produces CO2, carbon dioxide.
Hmm.
The body is very sensitive to this, and it needs to evacuate this as quickly as possible to maintain the pH balance of the blood.
Hmm.
By the same token, as the CO2 is being produced, lactate is being produced. And lactate is basically a byproduct of breaking down carbohydrates.
Yep.
It splits into two. You have a pyruvate that attaches to a hydrogen ion, that is lactate. The difference between CO2 and lactate is that lactate is a fuel source. It's half of a carbohydrate molecule.
Yeah.
So the response rate when we look at ventilation tends to be much faster because the CO2 gets into the blood and we need to evacuate it immediately. Whereas
Hmm.
lactate is going to be determined, the measurement of the lactate is going to be determined by how efficiently we consume that lactate as a fuel source versus how quickly it goes out into the blood. And so
Okay.
there's a differential there in terms of the rate of production, the rate of consumption, and some of the dynamics by which these two sort of byproducts of glycolysis or breaking down carbohydrates and
Yeah.
producing the energy. CO2 is a very fast acting thing that needs to evacuate very quickly. That's why ventilation is very responsive. Whereas lactate tends to lag behind. So, for example, if you are very efficient at burning lactate, like for example, when we work with some of these pros, they need like 15-20 minute long steady state stages just to present LT1.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Okay.
me on the side of a road, I would maybe need 5 minutes because my lactate consumption is not as efficient. And
Okay.
so
Is
they spring from,
mitochondria something to do with that?
has everything to do with it. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it gets cycled back into the mitochondria in a sense, right?
exactly. And so the more efficient you are, so you can kind of think of zone 2 as the first buffer of let's call it um, efficiency in your output, or maybe the better framing of it is, well, it's the first buffer that is trying to maintain your efficient output. So fat is going to be your primary fuel source for efficient consumption, or efficient energy production is quite abundant.
Yeah.
So it's just to kind of set the frame of like why zone 2 matters in the first place. It's extremely abundant. We have about 2 weeks worth of supply within our muscles, not the stuff we can grab on our
Yeah.
stomachs, but actually
Intramuscularly. Yeah.
within our muscles, we store about 2 weeks worth at any given time of fuel that our muscles can use in the form of fat. Versus carbohydrates, we have about 1 day's worth of fuel. So
Mm.
as we're training, whether it's for a race or just to improve our zone 2 and our VO2 max and for health and longevity. The whole point of it is to become better at consuming fat as a fuel source, because that is going to push out the need for transitioning to carbohydrates.
Hmm.
That then sets the foundation on which then the mitochondria is improving and sort of growing stronger. You're multiplying them within the muscle in order to accomplish that task, in order to be able to use that fat that's available. The reason why it starts dropping off is because the mitochondria basically just says like, oh shit, like we need to produce more work than we can sustain with our rate or fat oxidation, so we switch over to carbohydrates.
Hmm.
And if you stay in that zone 2, the body will start to adapt to being able to consume more both more and at higher intensities, more fat and at higher intensities. And so that is kind of the name of the game. And that is the foundation on which then VO2 max is built, because more mitochondria, more dense mitochondria, more oxygen consumption, that then raises your ceiling as well, or enables you to raise your ceiling. So it's super fundamental. And the mechanism is that you're basically improving your body's ability to burn fat. We can measure that through lactate. We can measure that through ventilation. Why can't we use heart rate to do this?
Mm.
And that is exactly for all the reasons that you kind of mentioned at the top, is because heart rate is primarily mapping to oxygen consumption. But now we know that zone two is actually primarily a carbohydrate, CO2, and lactate kind of a phenomenon. So the oxygen consumption can be correlated, but it's going to be also on the heart rate side. You have confounders, or can be correlated, but you have then also have confounders of things like heat,
Hmm.
uh, elevation, fatigue state, life stress, dehydration, fueling. All these things impact how the heart rate
Caffeine.
responds. Fitness level, caffeine, how you slept, all these things are kind of external stressors that really have no bearing on the metabolic performance, so to say. They
Yeah.
might have a bearing on how well your body receives the training, right? So you do the training, and if you have a lot of life stress that is messing with your heart rate, and you're not sleeping well, you're probably not going to receive the adaptations of the training very well. So
Okay.
it has a very important role to play, but in terms of pacing, it's terrible, and
Yeah.
because it has so many confounders. And we do this again and again in the lab, and we see this with all of our users, where if you're doing a proper zone two, or a VT1 interval, or an endurance type of a workout, what you'll often find is that the body tends to settle in metabolically. And so it'll overcompensate a little bit in the beginning, and then it'll
Hmm.
stabilize and even sort of reduce in ventilation. Lactate, you'll see it come down even. Fat oxidation might rise over time. And so the efficiency is actually improving, and what the heart rate might be doing that entire time is actually drifting 15-20 beats, telling us the exact opposite of what's actually happening.
When those confounders affect heart rate, are you saying that it's just the heart rate that's changing, or does
Yes.
that actually affect the athlete's physiological state, even if everything stays constant? It doesn't.
Yeah, the heart rate's just acting independently. And that might be because you are now needing to cool yourself, right? So your core temperature is rising a little bit. You're pushing out more blood into the capillaries and the small blood vessels to cool. You might be getting a little bit dehydrated. That's going to elevate heart rate independent of any metabolic output or workload that's going on. You might have a low cardiovascular fitness, right? So your heart is just not good at pumping out lots of volume per beat over longer periods of time, and that's an independent adaptation that happens as you gain fitness, as you put more volume and work into your legs. Your heart will get fitter in that respect, but it's not going to be associated. That particularly is not going to be associated with the metabolic output. Oxygen consumption is going to stay the same. CO2 production is going to stay the same. Lactate's likely coming down. Ventilation is stable and possibly even coming down a little bit. So you have this kind of divergent response, which confuses people, because when they only have pace and heart rate, they're looking at their heart rate and they're seeing, oh, my heart rate's going 10 beats higher, 15 beats higher. Should I be slowing down?
Yeah.
And there's been now several studies that have really borne this out, where not only does heart rate drift independent of the metabolic factors in terms of the workload that you're doing, but the pace or the power on the bike is also decreasing, because relative to your known thresholds, because you're getting tired. Your muscles are getting tired at the same workload.
Yeah.
Uh,
Fatigue, basically.
Yes, and that's
Yeah.
that whole concept of durability. And so
Mm.
now you have the two primary sources we have on our watches and on our computers. One of them is going high when it's actually it's not correlating with what's actually happening. The other one is either staying the same or going down,
Okay.
independent of the actual workload. And so you have
Okay.
these two completely, like, you know,
Going different directions, basically.
yes, exactly.
Okay.
So what do
Okay.
you do?
But is the physiological state actually changing, or is it
No,
still
staying the same.
so the physiological state is maintaining regardless. Okay, say someone is on a long run or a long ride, right? Heart rate climbs
Hmm.
because of cardiac drift,
Pace
and you're
drops.
saying power output or
Hmm.
pace drops
Yeah,
because of fatigue, but the physiological state might stay the same,
exactly.
or it probably is staying the same, right?
Yes.
And up to
And
now,
so,
we don't really have a way of
no.
measuring physiological state, which is, well, how I started the conversation. Like, we're trying to figure out what's the real physiological marker for knowing that we are in the correct intensity that we're trying to target for that session, right?
So we find that both of course, in our from our users, from researchers that we work with, others that we don't work with but are publishing on this stuff. The finding so far is that heart rate drifts, power pace declines as a result of fatigue over time, ventilation stays consistent. And lactate might even be lactate has some confounders as well. So, for example, Kilian Jornet has this anecdote where he was at the UTMB
Yeah,
with the lactate of like 12 or something like that.
yeah, yeah.
If you know lactate numbers, it's like there's no way you're whatever 13 hours into a race and you have a lactate
Yeah, I
of
mean, if you're running 100 miles, you're not going to be at lactate 12 for sure.
yes. And so what ends up happening with lactate, because it's a fuel source, it's not anything harmful. In fact, it can. They're now coming out with lactate based fueling supplements. So
Okay.
lactate is actually is an extremely powerful fuel, and so it can just hang around no problem, and it can pool. So if you are constantly producing lactate and you're consuming some of it, and then the rest of it can just kind of float around and give
Yeah,
it enough time under enough load, and it'll just start to accumulate without it actually meaning anything. And that kind of
okay.
gets to the whole idea of these continuous lactate monitors, where you have lactate production at the muscle level. And,
Okay.
and, and so the muscles are producing lactate as a result of glycolysis. Some of that gets
Hmm.
consumed, some of that gets pushed out into the blood. So then the differential there that you have between what is measurable in the blood versus what is actually being produced in the muscle, I think is about 10 to 20x. So that's one delta that we have, and that's also partially why we have the time course of like it needs to get into the blood in order to be able to measure it. That's why we need
Yeah.
longer stages to be able to measure it from blood. Now we're talking about the continuous monitors that are either working on typically they're on interstitial or maybe some sweat monitoring. That's then another layer of a differential where you have from muscle to blood, which is I don't know, 10 to 20x or sometimes more, and then you have the blood into the interstitial or then eventually into the sweat. And so then what is the gradient at which this sort of like process will actually occur in terms of the dispersion of the lactate across this cascade? How long does it take? How accurate is how dependent is it on the person's unique production or how this
Ability
cascade
to clear the lactate as well. Yeah.
for each person? And yeah, so there are a lot of kind of open questions there about just like how we'll actually be able to use this, in addition to then the confounders of then what does the signal mean on any given day with respect to my fueling state, like you mentioned at the top.
If heart rate has so many confounders, why do you think it became so dominant?
It was available. It's really interesting. If you go back to the space, I'll take us back a little bit. So if you go back to the moon landings and in the space
Okay.
program in the 60s, they were measuring heart rate, they were measuring breathing, they were measuring all sorts of things on the astronauts. If you look at the literature, the publications and patent filings of heart rate and breathing related things, if you track them from about that point of time when people started to really be able to measure these things, up
Hmm.
until maybe like the sort of the early 80s, you see them kind of like increasing in parallel. Like they're pretty much the same publications, publications, and then something happens in 1978 to 1980 where Polar releases the first wearable heart rate chest strap,
Okay.
and you just see this divergence. Heart rate in all these, whether it's publications, patent applications, it just goes in, like from 1980, just explodes.
Okay.
Breathing plateaus and pretty much starts to decline. And what ends up happening is, when the heart rate was introduced, no one knew about heart rate zones. No one really talked about HRV, or what it could do for rest and recovery. All these things that end up coming out of this, just ability to measure this, not just in a lab, but like in everyday use. The fact that it is directionally correlated with intensity, despite the confounders, et cetera, that we already talked about, but it's directionally correlated, so it becomes this sort of gauge of this internal gauge of intensity, and can be used for that. And so then you get heart rate zones, then you get
Mhm.
heart rate max and percentages, and for anyone that's in a lab. So if you're in a lab and you then where you can have the ground truth, you can measure lactate, you can measure metabolic heart, VO2, VCO2, ventilation. If you want to have any sort of bearing on practical application of what you're measuring in the lab, you need some way to transform that and translate that out into the field. And that's what heart rate's been used for, and that's how it's been adopted, in pretty much across the field in terms of use in athletics and so forth. So it was a practical tool. It was widely available, relatively cheap, and so forth. And so you have all these sort of like features that kind of evolve around it, and a lot of research that went into it. But it was, I would argue that it was applied in places where it really shouldn't have been applied, in terms of as a tool to assess like training zones, for example. Heart rate is a really, especially if you're doing it generically. And there's just, I mean, this, you can go back to papers in the 90s and early 2000s where they're just like, yeah, it doesn't work, but everyone does it. Like every Garmin, every
Yeah,
polar device you have pretty much does it the same way. That's been
it's
proven for
just a
decades.
generic calculation, I
Yes,
guess.
it just
Yeah.
literally doesn't work. And there's now been, like a really strong body of evidence that have put this to the test on thousands of people, randomized controlled trials, where they show that if you use power or heart rate based zones, you will get a 40 to 60% non-responder rate, meaning 40 to 60% of people will not improve their fitness despite doing the work.
Okay. And you said power and heart rate based zones.
Yes, because it goes to, if you're using any fixed metric, so it's whether it's an FTP and percentages thereof, if it's a max heart rate or a heart rate reserve formula and percentages thereof, that is where the trouble starts, because the individual response of what my FTP is, or what my 65% of heart rate reserve or max heart rate means for me, is very
Mhm.
different than what it means physiologically than what it means for you or anyone else.
Yeah, okay.
And so that spread is so large that you can have someone training at the same percentage of their heart rate reserve or same percentage of their FTP as someone else, getting dramatically different physiological effects from it.
Because
So
they're at different physiological zones. Is
yes,
that the reason? Okay.
and the only
Okay.
way to resolve this is to know where your VT1 and VT2 are, which is the ground truth from the lab. That's what we've been doing there for decades, and that is what FTP, percentages of heart rate zone, heart rate training zones, FTP power zones, all these things are trying to emulate, uh, but they miss the individualization aspect of it, because they don't have it within heart rate, within power data. You don't actually have the information to extract that knowledge.
Can,
That's
can I
what.
just stop you
Yeah,
for a second?
yeah.
You mentioned FTP all the time, and if someone cycles, they know exactly what FTP is. But can you
Okay.
explain it for someone that is a runner that is not into the cycling
It,
world and have no idea what FTP
it's
is?
so FTP is your functional threshold power. You can do a test. You can do a it's
Running
basically
test.
your 1 hour max
Okay.
speed, pace, or power.
Okay.
Um, and
I guess in the
uh,
running world, for a recreational runner, it's kind of like your 10K time, your 10K pace. That would
yeah,
be kind of around your
I'd say
function.
closer to probably, yeah, depending on your fitness level, yeah, between
Yeah,
10K and marathon. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, for an average for 50, 40-year-old guy, it's probably a 10K pace. For an elite, it's a half marathon.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
power. Yeah. Okay. So that just okay. Thank you.
And that's another, like, why power meters caught on, and it's super interesting. I was chatting with the founders of Training Peaks, and they really created FTP, this sort of notion, and they explained that, in the early 2000s, cycling in terms of technology use was a backwater. Like no one in cycling was using any kind of technology, which is completely contrasted to today, where it's just like,
The most technology.
so there is, and power meters completely changed that. And again, it's the availability of the data, and being able to then start to attach some meaning to the numbers, right? So it becomes practical. Same with the heart rate coming out in the late 70s, early 80s. You can start to attach meaning, and it becomes practical. It's sort of it's something that you can sort of hang your hat on, and it's helpful directionally. And so with FTP, that came out where power meters came out. They didn't really know what to do with them, uh, and they needed some way to like make sense of the numbers. And there was this notion of the 1 hour record. And so they were like, well, that's probably something that we can look at. So how long you can ride for an hour? What's your average power for that? That's a
Okay.
stake in the ground, and that's where that comes from. It's no more, no less than that. So it's not
Okay.
physiological.
Is it useful if you actually couple it with a physiological state? So basically, if you have your physiological zones coupled to your power, could power be a useful tool?
Oh yeah, it's great for pacing. That's good.
Yeah.
It's great for pacing, and
Okay.
when you have the physiological knowledge, it becomes so much richer. The power numbers and the heart rate numbers also, because
Yeah.
it turns everything on its head. And then you're pacing based on your physiology. You're allowing heart rate to drift. That's a pure signal, that you're increasing stress for whatever reason. Maybe you need to improve your hydration. Maybe you need to improve your fueling. Maybe you need to sleep better. That's what that signal is telling you. Not that you're pacing too hard. In most cases, power is the same. Like if you see your power starting to, or your pace starting to drop off after 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, that's a pure signal that that is the limit of your durability. If you're pacing based on that, then you lose that signal. And you start to conflate that with, oh, I just feel tired, and like, oh, I feel a bit dehydrated, or I'm like really hungry all of a sudden, and you don't really know why. Well, it's because the signal was trying to tell you something that you just couldn't receive that information. And the difference with ventilation is that it's independent of those things. It's really
Yeah.
reflect the physiological workload, and then you can allow heart rate to drift and tell you what it's actually trying to tell you. You can allow power to, or pace to drop and tell you what it's actually trying to tell you. So it becomes a much richer experience, and a lot of our users are reporting kind of a rebirth. People that have been
Yeah.
banging their head against FTP, trying to raise it, or pacing, always pacing their marathons
Yeah.
inappropriately, seeing where they should actually be, and just getting just like a complete transformation of, being, mid pack to actually winning age groups, and taking starting to improve after months or years of stagnation.
And I guess if you chart it over a long period of time, you can use your physiological state and you can see how your power has changed based on the
Yes.
same physiological state, right? I guess, I mean, that's how I would use it if having both tools, just to see, okay, this is my power now at this state, this physiological state, and after 6 months, what power am I producing at the same physiological state?
Yes, both over time. So tracking long-term trends, like obviously the name of the game is to be able to produce more work, power, pace, external work for the same physiological cost. So
Internal
you're
cost, yeah.
yes, and or increasing your internal ability to be able to maintain higher and higher workloads for longer periods of
Mhm.
time. And that's where training comes in. And the really nice thing about it is that the body adapts to what the training that you give it. And so a lot of people struggle with zone 2, is that they're actually in zone 3, and then you're
Mhm.
sort of past this point of like fat starting to drop. And in the lab you can see this super clearly. You can just see like below VT1, fat max, carbs are quite low. You make that transition, and it doesn't have to be a very big transition,
Yeah.
and then you just see it flip.
Yeah.
And then now the body is no longer adapting to improving their fat oxidation. It's now improving its ability to consume carbohydrates more efficiently, which is not a bad adaptation to have, but it's extremely limited. And so that's why people run into a stagnation mode, where like they're constantly pushing on this very limited kind of lever. And especially when they understand where their VT1 is, shift their training around, and then they just start to explode.
Before we go into or deep into the rabbit hole and talking about ventilation, um, can you tell us how you actually got into researching and studying ventilation as a training intensity metrics? I think I should have started with this, but yeah.
Yeah, we could have dove right in. My background may be a little bit atypical. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I worked in prosthetics R&D, so for knees and ankles, amputees, and
Okay.
particularly I had some experience in Paralympics, Paralympic athletes, and um, and then I went into developing exosuits for the U.S. military, where they basically wanted to make their soldiers more efficient out in the field, walk the same for less energy. And in both cases, whether you're making a prosthetic leg for an amputee athlete, um, Paralympian, or a able-bodied soldier that is out in the field uh, and trying to improve their efficiency, you have to you have to measure both. In both instances, you have to measure the actual metabolic output, which is measured with the metabolic heart. So we were working on these designs and these developments, these mechanical devices and these suits. And the way we would actually assess the whether we were doing the job, or the suit was, or the product was doing the job that it was supposed to, was by getting people into a lab, putting a face mask on them, measuring their breathing, measuring the contents of the breath. So we were understanding the oxygen consumption, the CO2 production, and we wanted to see, as we tweaked the design, that this was actually moving in the right direction, that we were becoming more efficient, not less. And so that was my first introduction to just measuring these things, and it was quite
Okay.
eye-opening because um, the level of detail you can start to see or understand someone's individual response to training is striking, and the differences between people is also quite dramatic. Um, and um, and so I was in there also as a former athlete myself who just overtrained. By the
Okay.
time I was 18, 19, I pretty much kind of ran myself into the ground. If it rotated on my body, it was kind of creaky and not working quite well. I had overtraining syndrome,
Okay.
and it was a result of too much. After the fact, I now know it was a result of too much intensity for too long, and not enough base and sort of foundation on which to build that type of workload. And when I got introduced to measuring these things in the lab, I was able to connect those dots in a very powerful way, where I could see, like, okay, this person is working extremely efficiently here and inefficiently there. And we were developing these devices, so we were actually having an impact on that mechanically from the outside, and you could just see it shifting. It's fascinating. And my thought was like, well, I mean, this is exactly what training does. We're just trying to have an external effect on it. So training basically introduces this stimulus that then the body responds to and builds back better. And so you can sort of use that signal to validate a design that it's actually, an external design, or that you've developed, that is actually trying to make them more efficient. You can also use that signal to validate if someone is training in a way that is going to introduce the same type of adaptation over time, just simply because they're targeting the right physiological state.
Okay.
And that was kind of like the key insight there. And then ventilation is this sort of like ground truth to all of this. So ventilation contains the oxygen and CO2 that we are breathing in and out. So the stuff that's going in and out of the muscles, the stuff that's feeding the muscles, and that the muscles are actually outputting and need to get rid of, that's the oxygen coming in, that's the CO2 going out. So everything that goes in and out of the working muscles has to go in and out of the lungs. And so there's this mapping there between the ventilation, the volume of stuff going in and out of the lungs, and the stuff that's going in and out of the muscles. And so that was kind of the first kind of, okay, if that's true, then you're going to have a very stable signal for workload, which ends up being the case in what we're seeing with the devices that we're doing now. And it's also going to show you the rate of that change, how that shift is actually occurring within the muscle as it becomes less efficient with more carbohydrate consumption, less efficient in terms of fuel utilization, not necessarily
Mhm.
oxygen consumption. So carbs are actually more oxygen efficient than fat, but they are less efficient in terms of their abundance
Yeah.
and the byproducts that they eventually create, that get created as we overly rely on them.
What kind of byproducts do they
Uh,
create
so
apart from lactate?
those pesky hydrogen ions that the
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
attaches to, and then the other byproduct is simply through depletion. So the body's
Okay.
extremely sensitive to carbohydrate depletion, and will start to panic pretty hard if it senses that we're depleting it too much.
So earlier you mentioned that if the metabolic state during a training session maintains stable, heart rate drifts upwards,
Mhm.
power output or pace kind of drifts downwards due to fatigue, but ventilation would also stay stable or very tightly coupled with the metabolic state. So what is it about ventilation that keeps it so anchored to the metabolic output?
So uh, the contents of the air going in and out of our lungs is a one-to-one mapping between the contents of stuff that's going in and out of the muscle. So if you
Okay.
if you breathe in oxygen, you're breathing in oxygen because your muscles are demanding it. And if you're breathing out CO2, you are breathing out CO2 because your muscles are producing it. And so the volume of stuff, there's a nice kind of physical principle of that air is incompressible.
Hmm.
And so the air that's actually being exchanged in the lungs is proportional to the amount of stuff there's a proportional to the work being done by the muscles, both in terms of oxygen going in and CO2 going out. And so by tracking the ventilation, we can actually have a window into are you stable, right? So stability suggests low CO2 production, because if you're producing CO2, you need to get that out, and you're going to become very unstable. That's what VT2 is, your second threshold. At VT1 and below, your ventilation is going to be quite stable. As it starts to rise, that's a result of CO2 being produced in the muscle, denoting that switch to more carbohydrate utilization, pushing up that ventilation. Maybe I can I'll quickly go through just like how ventilation responds and how it's different than heart rate, just to put it into context.
Yeah, please.
Which is, so heart rate's going to map pretty well to oxygen consumption. Uh, if you map them together, they're going to rise pretty much in concert with one another. And then most people will know how heart rate type tends to saturate at the top. You reach your kind of roughly your max
VO2 max as well, right?
VO2 max tends to
Yeah.
exact, and they're quite corollary in the base case, right? So then you have all the confounders and everything that can shift that relationship day by day or within a workout and so forth. But in this sort of like perfect scenario, they are quite corollary, and the rise is quite consistent. Um, the opposite is true of ventilation. So ventilation, when you're more efficient, will respond very little. It'll be quite stable at the low end, where it's going to be changing very little, because fat oxidation consumes more oxygen than it produces in CO2. And the opposite is true of carbohydrates.
Come on. Okay.
As you go from that fat oxidation to carboxidation, you make that transition. The real driver in the ventilation is that transition creates more CO2 production than it's taking in terms of oxygen. That's why
Okay.
ventilation starts to increase. And so as you make that transition, you go from a very stable ventilation to a very unstable ventilation. And that's same happens with lactate, very stable lactates at the low end, below LT1, and very unstable lactates at the top end when you're above LT2. Exact same phenomenon with ventilation, because it's responding to that sort of fuel transition that's going on within the muscles. And so you get this sort of non-linear response with ventilation, where it's quite stable, then it starts to gradually rise until it's just like going through the roof. So that's basically the
Okay.
foundation of why ventilation it can be is mapping so well to kind of the internal workload.
How is ventilation measured with Timeware? Is it breathing rate, tidal volume? How is that all mapped together to tell you or to
Yeah.
tell an athlete what is their intensity?
We measure the expansion and contraction of the chest cavity. So
Okay.
as you breathe in, you expand the chest cavity. As you breathe out, you compress it again. And that mapping is so there the amplitude, the peaks in that signal then become the breathing rate. So that's
Okay.
your breaths per minute, how often you breathe every minute. And then the amplitude of that signal, that's what gives us the relative volume exchange per breath. So our signal is a circumference change, but because
Okay.
of that principle where air is incompressible, there is a near one-to-one mapping of the circumference change to the volume exchanged. There are important caveats to that, but in vast majority of cases, whether especially if you're running or cycling, that mapping is gonna hold quite well. So then we take the amplitude of that signal, so looking at the volume per breath and the rate of the breaths occurring, we multiply them together, and that's the minute ventilation.
Okay. So it's not just the breathing rate, right? Because I would assume, well, thinking of it practically, a lot of runners fix their breathing rate
Yes.
to their step count, right?
Yeah.
So when I'm at, say, zone 2 or low intensity run, I'm maybe doing 4 steps inhale, 4 steps exhale, for example. My intensity increases a little bit. I might go to a 3-3 and then maybe to a 2-2 when I'm doing a VO2 max intervals. But anything more, you don't really go faster than a 2-2, for example, or anything slower, you don't really go slower than a 4-4, for example, right? So is it that tidal volume in between the breath rate that really gives you the data of where an intensity can change?
Yes, exactly. So
Okay.
so so it really depends on the runner whether they do this or not. We some people do, some people don't, and it's quite that I think that's like a fascinating topic on its own. And the way so the way breathing responds when you fix one of these parameters is that the other one is compensating in order to match the ventilation demand. So you have a certain oxygen your muscles are demanding. You have a certain CO2 your muscles are producing and need to get out. That doesn't change whether you decide to breathe at a 2-2, 3-2, 4-2, whatever. Um, so in order to match that demand, the breathing mechanism will
Hmm.
respond by, let's say you're entraining your breathing rate to your cadence in this way, or your intensity. The tidal volume will shift accordingly. And as you make that transition to match the ventilation demand, so let's say you have an hour where you go from a 3-3-3-2 and 2-2, and but you're sort of arbitrarily fixing that within the same for the same intensity. So the
Hmm.
intensity workload doesn't actually change. You're just changing your breathing rate pattern.
Correct. Yeah.
You will see the tidal volume flip and flop in order to match the ventilation demand. It's super fascinating. Um,
Okay.
and so the ventilation will actually be quite stable. Your breathing rate
So
will be
the minute ventilation will be quite stable,
yes, yes,
but the breathing rate can go up or down, and the
yes,
tidal volume will go in
yes.
reverse
Will
of
match.
that, right?
Yes, exactly.
If your intensity is the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Would lung volume or lung capacity play a role in this, or will it affect it?
Not in terms of measuring it, because
Okay.
we always benchmark the person. So when we measure ventilation, ventilation contains the information of VT1 and VT2, right? So as you traverse VT1 and VT2, you're doing so, and you are representing it, or you are kind of achieving that transition. The byproduct of that transition shows up in your ventilation. So the information is
Okay.
in the ventilation signal, as opposed
Okay.
to with heart rate, where we don't actually have any transitions in heart rate that show us where VT1 and VT2 are. Or in the power signal, it's just going to look like a flat line, and it's not going to have any information about where those transitions occurred. But with ventilation, it is in direct response to having that transition happen that the inflection points occur in ventilation, same as with lactate. And so we can benchmark, and what this is what we do is we benchmark each person's ventilation to their response. When are they transitioning over VT1? When are they transitioning over VT2? That gives us
Okay.
the unique markers for each person, for their VT1, for their VT2. it doesn't really matter how big their lung volume is. The transition is a rate change, um, and so um, and so it's a rate of change that is occurring. You are breathing, uh, let's say, more steady here, and then less steady, and then less steady, less steady. That transition is measurable, and
Okay.
is independent of the actual kind of total volume being exchanged, whether
Okay.
it's from a small lung or a big lung, or yeah, whatever. Yeah.
And how would you know at which transition is the athlete crossing over zones?
So that's a lot of work that we do. Is
Okay.
so there's a kind of a standard way to do it. One is,
Okay.
which is that you have someone do a ramp protocol, where they go from a very low intensity to a maximum or near maximum intensity over some period of time. So they're steadily increasing the intensity, and there, that's how you do it in the lab, and that's a really nice way to map this this response, because that gives you exactly where they start to increase, whether it's ventilation or lactate. It's done the same way. Protocols will differ a little bit because of the time course that I explained
Hmm.
earlier. So you'll have longer stages with lactate. You can have shorter stages to an extent with ventilation. But that allows you to see exactly where that transition, where that inflection point is occurring. What we're working on now, which is really promising, is so the base case in our app is that people can take these threshold tests and they can benchmark their VT1, VT2, get their training zones. That also gives you your training recommendations, like
And that's what they should do when they first get a strap,
yeah,
the
yeah,
Vital
that's what
Pro.
we
Okay.
yes, and
Okay.
that's what we recommend, and that because it just gives us it benchmarks their personal response. It also uncovers where they have room to improve. So if your VT1 is at a relatively low percentage of your VO2 max, that is suggestive of the fact that you have low hanging fruit to improve your aerobic base, and that
Okay.
also suggests that if you're trying to improve your race speed or your VO2 max, that you're going to have a hard time doing that with a
Base.
VT1 that's at a low percentage of your VO2 max. So it becomes kind of a constraint. Or if you have a high VT1 as a percent of VO2 max, it's really the ceiling that's starting to block you more than the base, and you need to focus more towards the top end to kind of raise that ceiling, and then you build some further improvement on the base, so you can sort of use these
Okay.
tests to ebb and flow. Okay, where am I deficient currently? Then you address that deficiency in your training, and the app also provides some suggestions and recommendations to both workouts, training plans, and so forth, to address those deficiencies. And then you can test again and see, okay, now I've improved my base a bit, and now the ceiling is the one that's really limiting, and I can shift some of that workload over to some intervals and so forth. So you can sort of ebb and flow, and have real kind of control over your training and how you're adapting. So that's sort of the base case.
Hmm.
Now with all this data that we're getting through, I mean, it's a lot of tests that we're receiving every week and every month, and then subsequent workouts with ventilation. And so what we're working on is building this model that is basically that is being trained to understand how how the breathing metrics respond with respect to VT1 and VT2, uh, independent of knowing what the VT1 and VT2 are. So
Okay.
part of it is trained by, we have a whole data set of labeled data where we have threshold tests. We know where VT1 and VT2 are. We say, okay, here's then a bunch of workouts, that are associated with these thresholds, and learn what the VT1 and VT2 or the breathing looks like with respect to them, and tell us just based on these workouts what the VT1 and VT2 are, without knowing about the test. And so it's creating this kind of dynamic output that is showing, if you traverse VT1 and VT2 within a workout, it is giving us a readout of that VT1 or VT2 or both.
Hmm.
And that's becoming quite interesting, because uh, a test is really just a snapshot of the day.
Yeah.
Um, but as we know, like, heart rate is going to fluctuate if we're using that to benchmark VT1. as we improve our work, as we increase our workload, ventilation might shift a little bit at VT1 or VT2 as we improve and so forth. Um, so there is this kind of ebbing and flowing that is quite natural for any given athlete on any given day within a workout, and fixing it to a test that you took 4 weeks ago is a good start, but it's quite limiting when the reality is that there is this sort of natural ebbing and
Change.
flowing that provides a lot of information, not only for intensity control on the day, but also understanding kind of how you're responding to training. Are you overtraining a little bit, or are you in a good way, or you all of a sudden go up to elevation, and then things start to shift, and we can now just
Yeah.
start to automatically detect those things because the information is in the ventilation signal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. Um, so yeah, yeah, we're very excited about that because it opens up a whole new realm of usability and insight into training that helps automate a lot of the things that make individualized training possible.
When would that be ready?
It's already live in beta. Yeah.
Okay. Um, you know, measuring ventilation sounds almost too good to be true. Too good to be true. So if you allow me to play devil's advocate for a while, where does ventilation fail? So are there any confounders, and in what conditions does breathing signal actually become unreliable?
The main ones are really kind of hardware form factor related. It capturing the signal, and maybe this is why it was like, you go back to the 80s, like why didn't ventilation or breathing measure sensors come into a
Yeah, that
consumer
was my
level?
next question actually, but great that you're addressing it right
Yeah,
now.
and it's because it's really hard. uh,
Okay.
and getting a good signal is simply just really hard at the price point that a consumer device can achieve. And it's really only in the last few years where we've had certain sensing technologies that have come online and have kind of met economies of scale to enable these price points, and that's coming down even further now. So it's quite recent that we've just been able to do this practically. Like if you, for example, look at, I mean, they've been doing sleep studies with
Mhm.
breathing measurements for decades. But if you look at those contraptions, it's like really cumbersome, and you wouldn't really go out for a run with those devices on.
Yeah.
And so it's been primarily a technological hardware development constraint to get the signal, and now that's getting solved. And I would say that the next piece of it is making it so sort of generic in a way that captures the breathing signal in all cases. So, for example, if you in certain scenarios, if you have tight clothing, because it's measuring the expansion and contraction. So if you
Okay.
have really
Yeah.
tight clothing, or if you have a backpack that is sitting on the sensor, depending on how you configure the sensor. So our current generation is susceptible to some noise and artifact introduction through those types of interactions. Um, we find that generally in running, if you're using like a pack or kind of an ultra pack or a
Mhm.
vest, it tends to not have any impact. So we work with, for example, Solomon Elite Running Group,
Okay. Okay.
and so we do some studies with them and find that it works quite well, independent of them having their sort of
The Paxson. Okay.
vibration packs and so forth. But if you're on a bike, for example, on a bike, and you have kind of a heavier pack, and you're kind of leaning forward, and it's kind of really pressing on the sensor, then you're going to have some artifact.
Okay.
With very tight clothing that can sort of interfere with it. So I would say on those are the main fronts, and those are addressable. We actually we're working now on new designs that really sort of yeah, make those even those scenarios manageable.
Yeah.
So all of it is addressable, and it's just more of a mechanical form factor type of
Okay.
sensor configuration, so forth, improvements. The other thing I would say is, on the point of entrainment, that happens, for example, in some runners where they entrain their breathing, and then they'll moderate their tidal volume to match the ventilation. Same
Mhm.
thing happens in cross country skiing, where we've done quite a bit of work.
Okay.
Um, and And rowing, of course, is like 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 stroke to breath. There, it's less about kind of not being useful or usable because of those artifacts, but
Okay.
the range gets tighter. The interpretation range gets tighter. So, for example, if you have a cross country skier, what they will do is that they will actually change their cadence relative to enable a higher breathing rate when things get hard. But it might be only
Okay.
from like a 45 breaths per minute to a 52 breaths per minute. Whereas a cyclist might go from when they're going super easy because there's almost no entrainment in cycling, they might have a range of like, from 20 breaths per minute to 70 breaths per minute. And so the interpretation of each scenario becomes something to consider. What does it mean to go from for a cross country skier to go from 45 to 52 means something that is different than someone that's doing that on a bike, for example.
Yeah, because breathing is not an automatic response to a certain extent, right? You can kind of control it, not like heart rate, where you can't control how fast your heart is beating.
Well, you can control one or the other factors. So it's like you can decide to slow down your breathing, but then your
Mhm.
tidal volume will increase to
Increase,
match the
yeah.
ventilation demand.
Okay.
And you'll see this in people that are kind of doing this sporadically. They'll kind of slow down their breathing, and then the tidal volume will jump up, and but the
Okay.
ventilation pretty much stays the same. So when we're thinking about kind of controlling our breathing, that's what's happening under the hood, and we don't even really notice it. And for example, if anyone has a time where or if you try this yourself, if you're at the end of a so you take your breathing rate at the beginning, you're just walking, warming up for your run. You do your run 1 or 2 hours, and then you're walking again, and try getting your breathing rate down to the same level that you were before you did your run.
Hmm.
It's going to be extremely uncomfortable, and that is really the body telling you that no, we actually still need to be
Yeah. Yeah.
evacuating this stuff. and
Okay.
um, and so there is an override mechanism, and but it's only on one of the variables, and that's why only having breathing rate is not great, but having breathing rate and tidal volume is really the key.
Yeah.
The um, the other thing too is that so this override mechanism comes centrally commanded, right? So you change your breathing rate from your mind, basically.
Yeah.
And that same response is what's driving perceived effort and the relationship between perceived effort and breathing rate, which is extremely and it's a very interesting relationship. So, for example, in this scenario where you have an evenly paced workload for 1 or 2 hours, the ventilation will be quite consistent. Power might drop, heart rate might drift, breathing rate will eventually start to rise, and tidal volume will drop because the perception of the effort as you go from first 10 minutes, second 10 minutes, into the first hour, second hour, the perception of the effort will increase. And so breathing rate actually increases along with that. That's been replicated
Unconsciously, that happens.
unconsciously.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. But then, of course, like you said, tidal volume would drop to compensate for that.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Okay.
And so it's this phenomenal signal on the breathing rate side of like how hard were you actually working.
All right. Okay, let's go in and talk a bit about the actual product itself, the Tymewear Vital Pro. Most people up to now have either only trained with heart rate or power meters. So if someone puts it on for the first time, the Tymewear Vital Pro, what is it going to tell them, or how are they going to interpret the data, which they don't currently get with heart rate and power? What kind of difference are they going to experience?
First thing you do is establish your VT1 and VT2. These are
Okay.
fundamental. This is the fundamental way to define your training zones.
Okay.
And you will get associated with your VT1 and VT2 as well as your VO2 max. You will get an associated metric of ventilation. So your ventilation at VT1, ventilation at VT2. We also show heart rate at VT1, heart rate at VT2, pace, power. All these things are associated with the transition of VT1 and VT2. Um,
Okay.
that sets up your individual training zones. So for zone two, for example, you want to stay below VT1.
Hmm.
For any hard intervals, you want to go above VT2. Simple as that. The real difference is in that a lot of people, when they're basing, or many people, when they're basing it on heart rate or power or pace alone, is that they have it's very hard to know where that VT1 is. Um,
Yeah.
and so what we often find is a very sort of reproducible phenomenon where someone is trying to improve their fitness or trying to improve their race times, and they're overshooting VT1 in particular, because you might have someone with a 60 VO2 max, quite fit, with a relatively low VT1. For them, it's going to be very easy to override their VT1. It's easy for them to run faster than VT1, and so it feels easy, it feels doable, and so then they just spend a lot of time there, but really they're not getting the adaptation that VT1 and below gives, which is that fat oxidation improvement, that base building, and so forth. And when
Okay.
they make that realization of where VT1 actually is, and they change their training around to actually target that zone appropriately, then you start to see base building really start to happen, race times improve, durability improve, and so forth. So many users report kind of these transformations of just like they completely overlooked this one thing. Generally fit people overlooked this one marker once they were actually able to know where it was, target it in training, and they start to see all these improvements. Training also gets more fun because you're not always you, you're not always actually overtraining.
Yeah.
On the other side, if you have relatively low fitness and you're for example trying to if you're working on your in your training in running or cycling for that matter, but this is a particular case in running because uh, running is quite demanding, and if you're below say about 50 VO2 max, it's going to be actually quite hard to run below VT1. Um, uh, so it's very easy for in that scenario for people to sort of plateau or slightly overtrain and not make a lot of improvement because they're in the mindset of running, but their VT1 is relatively
Solo.
so low that they can't actually run at VT1. And so just that realization alone, and then they start to, and then you start you get into this negative feedback loop of like you're improving your carb oxidation, you're improving your lactate consumption, but that's a very small amount of improvement that you can make, and
Yeah.
you'll hit that limit quite quickly, and then you'll start to erode because or not improve. And so for in those cases, it can become truly transformational where they adapt the training to staying below VT1, do
Which
blocks
might
of
mean
training,
walking for them, right? I guess.
walking, treadmill,
Yeah.
incline treadmill, hiking, rucking.
Yeah.
Yeah, all these things are phenomenal, and you will really feel the difference. You'll feel it in just how your muscles feel afterwards when you actually do these workouts in the appropriate way for that person, and you'll feel it in the durability, and then over time the running will come because now you're starting to raise that ceiling,
Yeah.
raise that floor, and eventually that unlocks the appropriate running intensity, and so and then you're off to the races. And
Hmm.
so just having this knowledge of where this marker is extremely powerful, and I would say that's the primary kind of transformation, is that you just can know this is where my fitness level is. um, you can then take that and turn it into training, and training that will actually systematically improve you without overtraining you.
I think that's really why I'm like really excited about this product, is because it's really coupled to your physiological state, and it's not fluctuating. You're from Iceland, you live in Boston. Most of the time it's cold, or it rarely gets very hot. I live in Finland, but I'm from Singapore. So if anyone has trained or ran in a tropical country with 100% humidity, you see your heart rate go up
Yes.
at very low intensity. And the question I've always asked myself is that changing my physiological state, or am I actually still in zone 2 with that bump in heart rate, right? So I think this would be one device or one tool that can really help. break through that noise. If this conversation made you realize that your watch and generic formulas may not be giving you your true physiological zone 2, the Tymewear Vital Pro is the only consumer wearable I'm aware of that measures your training zones through ventilation. You can save $100 on the Pro Training membership using my code ELAPTW26 at checkout. The link is in the description below.
We have users in Singapore, and they are pro triathletes. They have access to the national labs there. They get tested indoors, lactate, VO2, you name it. They they take those numbers in terms of the heart rate and the power out into 70-80% humidity,
Yeah.
34 to 40 C, or 105 Fahrenheit. uh,
Yeah.
and those numbers just completely uh,
Out the window.
out the window.
Yeah.
And I was just interviewing a few of these users recently, and they say that they've transformed their training because the ventilation stays consistent. They allow heart rate to go up. They allow power to drop, importantly, because in those scenarios, the power is going to drop even more than just in sort of kind of temperate conditions. And the main changes have been in the just the effect of not overtraining anymore. So having the confidence to allow that power to decrease, knowing they're still getting good training, and then seeing that on the back end of more consistent training, better durability, better race times, and so forth as a result.
Heart rate variability is something people use these days as a readiness metric daily. Could breathing rate in the morning be used as a readiness signal?
I would rather say that the ventilation on the day, potentially the breathing rate when you're starting your workout, will really tell you a lot.
Okay.
If you're tired, if your legs are tired, if you've been doing a fair amount of work, you're just not going to be able to produce the external workload, so pace or power, at the same ventilation, and it's going to go high, and it's going to tell you, okay, now we actually need to pull this back a bit. And so in that sense, it just continues to stay true to that physiological index that we're talking about, and less so about, kind of like in the same way that HRV or something like that can be used as a kind of a system gauge of
Central
how
nervous system.
central
Yeah.
nervous system gauge. Yeah, but more so about like just the same mechanism by which you use it every other day in terms of ventilation and using it to pace these intensities and workouts. That will just show up in the training, and you will just see like, I just can't maintain my VE, and so I need to pull this back.
You mentioned durability a lot. Could you talk a bit about what you mean by durability?
Durability is basically your muscle's ability to maintain workload at the same physiological state. So how quickly does your pace drop off for the same internal workload, or how well do you delay that drop off?
The muscle soreness, the fatigue, I guess. Is that what you're referring to?
It's more about, so the way they measure this in the lab is that they'll do a VT1 assessment at the start when you're fresh. They'll take you through a 2-hour protocol,
Okay.
at maybe, let's say, 90% of VT1 output in terms of the
Okay.
workload, so power or pace, and then they'll assess VT1 again, and the delta in the pace or the power in at VT1 between those two points, is going to be your durability drop off.
And it comes from the muscular side of things, right? I guess.
Yes,
Okay.
and VT1 training is key for this durability. So kind of what we're seeing now is VT1 is what wins races, quite
Okay.
quite. If you take the idea of, and this is kind of this is another way to think about the durability concept. If you take a cycling race, and you have these five hills, and on as the riders go up the first hill, there's 15 at the top, at the front group. They go up the second one. There's 10 of them.
Hmm.
The third one, there's 7 left, and so on. And by the time they get to the final hill, there's only 1 left.
Jonas Vingegaard is left.
Exactly. And difference, and the difference is in the durability. Um,
Okay.
and the way that the way that VT1 training affects that durability is by pushing that fat oxidation further out and training the muscles to respond to the fatigue that occurs right at that limit. You do a few things. So you improve fat oxidation, so you preserve carbohydrates, and that's key for maintaining available carbohydrates throughout a 5-6 hour race or longer. If you're doing an ultra, for example, it's even more important. And so you preserve those carbohydrates in the early innings, those first few hills, so that at the end they're still there. You have high carb oxidation rates and high fat oxidation rates. The other guys were starting to drop off because they were starting to deplete those resources faster than the guys that maybe had more training in their legs and so forth.
But would muscular endurance also play a part in that threshold or in that drop off,
Yeah,
apart from just
there's a
fueling
lot.
substrate?
There are a lot of compounding factors there.
Okay.
And But if you neglect this VT1, if you neglect the VT1 training, then the muscles don't adapt to improving that limit, and then it may maybe stagnate or sort of erode a little bit, and that's kind of that can be the difference maker.
Apart from ventilation monitoring, is there any other real-time tool that someone can use to catch the delta between where your metabolic state is at any intensity versus heart rate rising and power dropping?
I think a nice way to think about this is any tool you use or will develop should be systemic. And heart rate is a systemic response. It just happens to not always map to metabolic output quite as cleanly as we would like. Ventilation is a systemic response. It's a whole body response. It's receiving the signals of and the inputs and outputs of the whole body in much the same way as heart rate is. Um, Pace and power are systemic responses, right? So they are the result of the whole body doing something. And so for that, they are really nice signals, and they can tell us a lot. They're extremely rich, but as long as we use them in the appropriate way. And then you have more kind of localized things like muscle oxygenation. You have things like sweat in that's not metabolic, so it's not really intent, like it's not technically intensity controlling, but it could be a systemic response in terms of just how much you're depleting certain certain elements and so forth. So for that, it can be a systemic response, but the main question there is how you then use that on a day-to-day basis, and what's the input to training on an ongoing basis. There, I'm not super familiar with it, but then you have localized responses, like how much if you put a muscle oxygenation sensor on a muscle body, then you're looking at the local muscle and some dynamics at that local muscle. You're not getting a systemic response, and so it becomes limited in terms of how you can then interpret that and use it. And that's why those technologies tend to be quite difficult to use systematically. Lactate is another systemic response. The question just becomes like how accessible and how reliable is the measurement once you get it.
One last question before we start to land the plane. When someone is stressed, I'm not talking about training stress, but just general stress, right? They tend to have a shallower breath and a higher breath rate, um, even when they're not training. Would that affect the signal when they move on to training with Tymewear?
No.
Or, okay, I guess it equalizes when somebody starts moving their body, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the breathing is just matching the demands of the
Okay.
of the muscles.
Okay.
So if your muscles demand more oxygen and produce more CO2 that the body needs to get rid of, the ventilation will meet that demand. whether you breathe at a really high breathing rate and a low tidal volume, or a really low breathing rate and a high tidal volume, that demand will get met.
Okay.
Um,
No.
and the thing that I would say is that, breathing, there's for sure a good amount of scope for improving efficiency of the breathing action itself. So one thing that I would that is so breathing is done by a muscle just like any other.
Yeah.
The diaphragm and the intercostals that are performing the breathing action. These are just muscles, and they can be they have
Trained.
they can be trained.
Yeah.
They have an endurance component. They have a coordination component. Just like we would train our biceps or our hamstrings
Yep.
through whether it's squats or if we're doing whatever sort of dynamic movement you might be training the muscles through. The breathing muscles behave very similarly,
Yep.
and especially in high intensity exercise, the oxygen consumption of those breathing muscles can be significant. I think on the order of about 15% of total oxygen
Yeah.
consumption
Yeah.
um, uh, at high intensities. So it's not a it's a in that sense. Uh, Breathing efficiently through those workloads, and by efficient, typically what that means is that it happens at a lower rate and a higher volume, because that tends to lower the oxygen consumption of the muscles. So
The metabolic cost of the breathing itself.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and but I wouldn't say that's like the lowest hanging fruit, so, and it's also, I'm still like we see just like really phenomenal athletes that would like quote unquote be like, no, you need to like train your breathing because you
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
like a
I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this brand, ISOCapnic.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, Dr. Andrew Sellers. I've had it on my
yes,
podcast. I have the device right here. So yeah, it
yeah,
he talks. Yeah, yeah, exactly that. There we go. Yeah, so yeah, I think that could pair very well with Timeware.
yeah, yeah. No, we're
It's,
in touch with those guys, and they, for example, now are doing some work with Visma as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and
yeah. If you want to train the muscles that help you breathe, your diaphragm and intercostals, so you can move more air with less effort and potentially reduce the energy cost of breathing during hard efforts, I've linked the ISOCapnic BWB device in the description below. You can also use my code JustmanSo at checkout to get 10% off your order.
I think for people with dysfunctional breathing, or people that are in sports where you have a high level of entrainment, like cross country skiing, rowing, possibly in some runners that have a high level of entrainment, possibly, although the restriction there is less. So but especially in those types of sports where the limiting factor becomes how well can you service the metabolic demand of the muscles through your breathing. So if your limiting factor becomes you just simply can't get the CO2 out, or you can't get the oxygen in, that becomes a significant limiting factor, and it's rate limited by the cadence. So how fast do you have to go? How much cadence do you have to go? That's going to rate limit how many breaths you have in a given minute in order to
Yeah,
accomplish that servicing. And so if you can get more volume per breath in those sort of rate limited instances, you
and
could
you
have a
lower
real.
your breathing rate.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
the breathing rate is fixed. So the
Oh
main
yeah,
trick,
for those. Okay, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
that's right. Yeah,
So the main trick there is being able to enable higher workloads through more tidal volume.
yeah.
And so
And
if
that's like lung
if your
capacity
muscles,
expansion to a certain
yeah, so if
extent.
your muscles can technically physically your muscles can output more, but your breathing starts to become the limiting factor of just like we can't get the CO2 out, pH starts to rise, and that becomes your main limiting factor. Not then being able to increase that volume per breath can be a huge difference maker, because it allows you to exchange more CO2 out of the body, and so forth. So
Yeah,
and
makes a lot of
possibly,
sense.
yeah, yeah, and so there it can be significant, and then uh, being able to train. So there's this link between breathing rate and perceived exertion. And it's not clear to me which direction it goes or if it goes in both directions. So like
Okay.
if you start to stress, your perceived exertion increases and therefore you send the signal down and breathing rate increases, or whether it's the breathing rate starts to increase, you start to sense it and you start to kind of feel discomfort. If it is true that it is the other way also, that you are perceiving this increase in the respiratory rate, and you can sort of train your muscles, because the reason that it can also be happening is because as the diaphragm muscles fatigue, it's much easier to do this movement than it is to do this movement.
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so the same thing goes for your breathing muscles, and so they kind of are starting to revert to a kind of a more efficient but less efficient, kind of an easier but less efficient way of breathing. And if you can train your breathing to be more coordinated, service the muscles in a better way, to meet that ventilation demand that is there. It's going to be met independent of whether it's at a high breathing rate or a low breathing
Yeah.
rate, and then the tidal volume is going to flip in those different scenarios. And if you can train that coordination and that endurance at the breathing rate levels that you expect to be seeing, like in a race or something like that, then you could sort of start to kind of delay that at least feed up signal. And there's some potentially interesting things around that there, where it's like the perception of the effort will then start to decrease a little bit, and allow you to meet that demand more efficiently.
Fantastic. All right. Anar, my closing question for you is, what does endurance mean to you?
Uh, uh, well, I always sucked at endurance, so to me, it's I'm a sprinter, and that's maybe like why I got into this whole thing, because like I just couldn't figure out why my endurance sucked.
Okay.
And you can, if you have crap endurance or really good endurance, you can thank your mother, because it's inherited through the
The
egg.
mitochondria.
The mitochondria is inherited through the egg, so everything you have there is in thanks to your mother. And my mom is she's very strong, but she's not great at endurance. So it goes hand in hand. um, but for me personally, it's been just like endurance is just something that has been a kind of a real learning curve. And I think that a lot of people kind of have the same. It seems basic, like you just go for a run, you go for a ride, but it has all these like really interesting nuances, unlocks. You can be, training yourself into the ground without realizing it, thinking that you're doing something really good, or you can be all of a sudden making all this progress and not
Mhm.
really understanding why. Um, and the fascination for me with endurance is that it is these things are knowable. Like we know these things in the lab, and sort of uncovering them has been a fascinating journey,
Yeah.
personally and professionally. And it's also just such a fundamental thing. Like endurance is something that if we think about just health span, longevity,
Yeah.
it is the dominant factor. Uh, if you look at all other sort of attributes or lifestyle choices, having good endurance, meaning like high VO2 max, strong VT1 aerobic base, those two go hand in hand. Um, if you can solve that problem, then your chances of having a
A long
longer,
life.
as long as possible health span, and sort of reaping the fruits of life as long as possible,
Yeah.
is that much greater. And that's crazy. Like there's nothing out there that does that,
Yeah.
uh,
No,
other than
exactly.
this. So it's worth solving.
It is worth solving. Yeah. Anar, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.